You're listening to The Premium Murder Experience, a short story by Bear Mawasagi. There is a damp chill that pervades through the walls of Old Blythe Manor, not unlike that which one might feel on a rainy, late October evening walk. It is hard to escape the feeling of being followed when walking the halls, and guests are often overcome by the sudden impulse to check behind them, sure that they had heard footsteps or caught glimpses of some otherworldly passerby in the otherwise empty spaces. Marketing was working hard to turn this to their benefit. You're never alone at Old Blythe Manor. Murals of mummies and werewolves and vampires and, of course, classic Casperian-friendly ghosts littered the executive table. Advertisements displayed swamp creatures lounging in the recently installed outdoor hot tubs, their thick muck of ages wearing away to reveal beautiful men and women beneath. There was even a movie throwback poster of a large, gelatinous blob creature consuming everyone in a cafeteria space, but a long and arduous discussion had eventually decided that the imagery might put guests off of their appetite and cause them to spend less in turn. While the drafts all carried a playful tone, worries had been expressed that this might not be entirely appropriate. "Let none of us forget," said the head of the table, "that these haunting rumors were started due to a brutal murder spree on the grounds." "Right, we should mostly stick to ghost imagery." 12 stuffed suits nodded in agreement while an underpaid draftsman, the only artist among them, scrawled quickly to capture their ideas. Now, as the lawsuit against the hotel is still ongoing, it might be deemed crass by the public if we were to roll out the marketing campaign too quickly, said the head of the table. Of course, said the sniveling man at his side. Somehow, he always managed to secure the chair at the right hand of the table. "But it has been 5 months. Our attorneys assure us that resolution with the surviving family members is close, and they're positive they've secured image rights of the deceased." 12 sets of nearly identical grunts echoed with the simultaneous tucking of shirts, a ritual that had become unspokenly shared among the board some time ago, performed at any mention of the unpleasantness as it had come to be known. "Where are we on room restoration?" "Well, the blood is almost out. Our head of maintenance has assured us he could clean the rest in an afternoon, but it has come to our attention that this might actually help resolve one of our budget concerns." "In what way?" "Well, if we're going to be decorating the room to serve as our main attraction, why not keep those decorations authentic?" The draftsman grimaced at the suggestion, but only inwardly. He had seen the interior of the murder room in person only once as reference material for the early promotional work, but the memory of it still made him sick to his stomach. He had seen, however, how others had been let go for not fitting with company culture after showing more visceral reactions, so he learned quickly to keep those feelings to himself. The rest of the table was nodding along fervently, as if this were the best and most practical idea since the invention of the flushing toilet. "Approved," said the head of the table. "Put up some sealant or primer or whatever it is they use to preserve color in case someone decides to touch the walls. We could repurpose some of the velvet rope from the auditorium, too, to keep people's hands off of it. And put up a sign. We don't want liability if anyone catches something." "Does this mean we won't be going forward with the premium murder experience?" asked a man at the far end of the table. "We are, but we're taking it in a different direction," said the head. "You missed our last meeting, but we'll be renting out each of the rooms next to the murder exhibit. That way we can charge the same fee twice. I think it was Henderson who suggested we could even have someone stay in the murder exhibit overnight to bang on the walls. That should add to our reputation." The meeting was adjourned, but as everyone rose to leave, the head of the table made one last small comment to the draftsman. "Aren't you sleeping next to the murder room now?" The draftsman nodded. "You've been getting the premium experience for free. We should start deducting that from your pay." Everyone in the room laughed at that, and the draftsman forced himself to laugh with them. When the contract had first arrived on his desk, the draftsman had been excited to see that employee housing was to be provided. He didn't look closely enough at just where they would be placing him. The east wing of the 3rd floor, where the murder of the Drysdale family had taken place, was closed to the public. Private employees, however, were frequently seen skittering in and out of 2 security doors that had been installed to keep out nosy guests. At first, these barriers were necessary to keep the unwitting from seeing the true carnage that had been reaped along the floor. While Drysdale Sr. had killed his family mostly in their sleep, he hadn't exactly halted his activity there, nor had the family been content to die peacefully in their beds. Although he wasn't there to see it himself at the time, the draftsman heard that the walls of the east wing had all been painted something like a modernist nightmare in shades of red. Regardless of whoever had originally planted that imagery in his head, it had festered over time and flourished into the intrusive thoughts that now plagued him whenever he made the walk to his bedroom. Only once had he made the mistake of bringing that up with a fellow hotel worker when he hoped to delicately broach the subject of perhaps moving to another wing of the hotel. Instead, that had started another conversation with the marketing department about fluorescent paints and whether or not they could be made to glow red on certain nights. So now, whenever the draftsman retired for the evening, he tried to keep his eyes to the floor, and when his mind drifted too hard toward thoughts of blood still soaked deep into the carpet, he walked blindly. The path was so familiar to him now that he could make it without sight, although he still felt vulnerable keeping his eyes off of the shapes that sometimes followed him down the hall. He hadn't made the mistake of bringing that up with his fellow employees again, not after the first incident. But he did notice that more than a few of the other hotel staff had developed the habit of glancing behind themselves at odd intervals, and it wasn't long before they started telling stories of their own. Retreating to the confines of his bedroom wasn't even a relief anymore, save for the small window of distance it bought from the madness of his co-workers. Ghosts might be able to pass through the walls at any time, he thought, but at least the chatter of the marketing department couldn't find him upstairs. Occasionally, he might hear someone's voice muffled through the walls, but he always told himself that this was simply the other employees talking to each other in their own accommodations. The few times that it almost certainly wasn't, the draftsman still told himself that it was. A half-stuffed cot hung on an ancient wire frame, screaming like the souls of the damned as it unfolded from hinges that had long forgotten the days of oil. The sound of it surely added to the rumors of the hotel, but so too had the myriad other things he'd seen in his days here. Too often now the draftsman forced himself to leave the ancient CRT television on late into the night. Its sound and light helped drown out the things that lurked in the darkness, those lingering nightmare fragments conjured in his mind from long days with the marketing department, helping them to concoct their rituals and convert the supernatural to cash. All of it sparked the fires of his imagination into a private hell burning in his brain, and only the softly droning tones of old cable reruns helped quench the flames. There were a few times, mostly in the early morning, where one of the old channels would give out and instead hiss in angry static at him, blinding the room white with snow, but those startling incidents were sparse enough that the television was still a net benefit on most nights. The offerings lately were growing sparse, however. Poltergeist, The Conjuring, The Exorcist. He thought he found an old black-and-white sitcom only to learn it was an episode of The Twilight Zone, and when he finally managed to find something with a laugh track, it was The Addams Family. At least that was meant to be comical, but it was with no small amount of dismay that the draftsman realized the hotel had finally gone through with their plan of only playing horror-related content on their channels. He sighed, striking another day off the calendar toward the end of his 6-month contract. Save for when the TV began to hiss static at him early in the morning, he slept through all the bumps in the night. Even when he wasn't in meetings, the draftsman did most of his work in the conference room. It had been built on the first floor, a newer addition to the old manor, and so was without a history with which to grow legend. Never had the draftsman held much interest in the placid tones and neutral architecture of corporate generica, but in this gig they came as a relief from the ever-present gloom that colored the rest of Old Blythe Manor. He noticed, too, that he wasn't the only one who preferred to stay in the recent addition. Not once in his time here had he seen any of the executives so much as take a step into the old building. Today, however, he was forced to vacate his seat at the table. Some visiting firm, consultants from another business that had converted a similarly haunted property into a tourist attraction, had come to give a safety and liability talk regarding the planned premium murder experience. Without his usual refuge in which to hide from Old Blythe Manor, the draftsman thought maybe he could try working at the poolside. This was quickly ruled out. Aside from the inane chatter that was a common affliction to the artistically inclined, "Is that your drawing? Can you draw me?" They were right in the middle of the rainy season, and the dark storm clouds that marketing was so eager to exploit blanketed the patio in a heavy rain that wouldn't play well with paints, pens, and paper. There was always the employee lounge, of course, but he was only able to stay there for a few minutes before the gossip of the workers on break began to get to him. "I heard something in my room last night. I saw my shadow move on its own in the bathroom. My mother came to me in a dream and told me my death was imminent. I know it was her too, because she was always saying stuff like that." In a huff, the draftsman moved from the employee lounge to the employee cafeteria, which was a much more hole-in-the-wall experience than the fabulously restored public dining room. Apparently, in this place, the definition of public did not stoop so low as to include employees, so the draftsman was forced to take his meals in the formerly and aptly named servant's kitchen. When he found that the breakfast offering that morning was ghost on toast, it wasn't just lactose intolerance that put him off his appetite. On the floors where housekeepers made their rounds, their accompanying radios spouted eagerly the conspiracy-laden theories of popular morning programming, going on about little green men and the lizards who secretly run our government. Desperate for solace, for a single moment of peace away from the madness of the others, the draftsman trudged back to his room to try working in silence. At least ghosts, he thought, were courteous enough only to whisper at night. Stacks of drawings and still wet paintings settled on the nightstands and end tables he used as easels. The draftsman had managed to carve out a few hours of productive work before a ruckus began in the other room. It started, as most hauntings do, with a hearty thump on the wall above his bed. The draftsman's heart near leapt out his mouth before he remembered that the head of maintenance, really their only maintenance worker, was supposed to do his final cleanup work on the room today. He could hear the scraping of what must have been the faux brass pillars of velvet ropes used to convert the crime scene into a tour. Whatever program he might be listening to on his radio, the draftsman didn't begrudge the head of maintenance his easy listening, knowing how eerie it must be to work in a room like that. Still, he turned up his TV loud enough to drown out the muffled moanings through the wall and got back to work. "You're never alone at Old Blythe Manor." That was the phrase marketing had settled on after weeks of debate. It was friendly, everyone said, and welcoming, but with just the right hint of the supernatural. It beat out the competitor phrase, "Old Blythe Manor, our prices are killer," only by a narrow margin. Even after marketing had settled on the right phrase, there were still weeks of debate as to what was the simultaneously most welcoming, but still classy, but scary, but not too scary while still remaining vaguely supernatural, typeface. It was only through fervent debate that the draftsman had managed to steer the executives away from papyrus, and it was only through a long war of attrition on their part that they beat him back down to what was essentially papyrus light. Although the draftsman had managed to add a touch reminiscent of horror movie posters one might have seen in a 1920s matinee. It was a prime example of design by committee, which was a unique horror of its own. The draftsman worked a few more hours on the final placing of typefaces over the new advertising imagery when a leak sprung from the ceiling. Really though, at this point, the leak didn't disturb him all that much. The corroded pipes had started giving out weeks ago, staining his water red and lowering shower pressure. The draftsman was mostly thankful that the droplets were landing on his sheets instead of his still-drying work. Folding the bed back into place, he heard that screeching of the damned again, and the walls began to pound loudly at him. The draftsman pounded back, yelling that it wasn't his fault, before settling back down to work in a musty old armchair that the executives had insisted on keeping for authenticity. The ancient frame prodded into his back at odd angles like iron fingers stroking over his skin, but he managed to force himself comfortable after a bit of squirming. With no ceiling light to rely on, he had to take his bedside lamp and perch it on a shelf over his head, running the cable across the room so that he had to step around and under it whenever he reached for his materials bag perched on the floor. He'd learned months ago to keep his markers and ink pots and paints on the floor after the first few times they'd fallen over in the night. The shelves here were unsturdy, he thought, or perhaps the foundations of the building had sloped uneven after so many years. He could have checked that with a level, of course, but what would that prove? The executives had already shown that they would never invest more than the minimal amount possible into any endeavor, a lesson sorely learned by the fine details of the draftsman's meager-paying contract. In fact, they would probably try to twist the tilted foundation into some sort of feature for marketing, and that would only create more work for the draftsman. What would be the sense in that? By crooking his neck to pin the lamp in place, the draftsman managed to get a few more hours of work in. Of course, that was when the afternoon electrical problems began. They must have been rewiring things around the hotel all the time, because the lights and TV sometimes had a habit of flickering on and off again. The draftsman dragged his armchair over to the dying light of the window, sunlight struggling through storm clouds, and turned too late to keep the lamp from falling from the shelf to shatter on the ground. He sighed, knowing this would come out of his increasingly dwindling paycheck. The employer-provided accommodations didn't comp visits to the employee cafeteria, he had learned after his first month. A good portion of his pay was already docked from paying hotel food prices, and his weight had dropped significantly since. It was a fair enough deal, he tried to tell himself. He had been meaning to lose weight anyway. There was only 1 week left on the contract anyway, and there was only a few more paintings to dry before he was set to deliver on the new marketing blitz. The posters, paintings, the planned jingles, all of it was set to roll out at the end of the week. Soon he would hand over his work, done on time and under budget, and finally be done with this damn place so that he could move on to a more cheerful job. Perhaps he would advertise for a resort people actually wanted to go to. An old creaking manor in the middle of rainy mountains might make good ambience for a horror movie, but it had been a miserable waste of half a year in reality. The draftsman was setting his completed work on the floor, safe from redly leaking pipes and untrustworthy shelves, when he heard screaming suddenly from the other side of the wall. It had to be the radio. "I need help!" a voice called. It was muffled. Undoubtedly, the head of maintenance, their only maintenance worker, had encountered something that only 4 hands could solve. The draftsman tried to ignore him, but he started to pound on the walls. "Please," he said, "you have to help me." Frustrated, the draftsman tried instead to pretend that he wasn't in. The TV had been turning itself on and off so often now that he simply unplugged it, hoping that the lack of noise would be interpreted as him leaving the room. This bought a few minutes of peace, aside from when one of the old paintings fell off the wall. "You're never alone at Old Blythe Manor," the draftsman said resignedly. He stood, stretched, and started the walk over to the premium murder experience, keeping his eyes to the ground as he did so. The door was open. Most everyone tried to keep it closed whenever they could. The draftsman had picked up this habit as well, learning to sense its presence in the darkness of his blind walks, and it was maybe by habit that he almost forced it closed to turn away. Instead, he kept his eyes open to the floor, trying to imagine himself floating above the river of blood-soaked carpet as he ignored the shadows growing at his back. "You're never alone at Old Blythe Manor." The inside of the room looked as gruesome as it had the first time he'd seen it. Authentic, the executives liked to say. Just like the crime scene pictures he'd been forced to study from for composition, 3 sets of pillows and the silhouettes of bodies were stuffed under the covers of the bed. They even leaked red, trickling onto the floor like a gentle rain. They were really going all out on the experience. Realizing he was still looking at the floor, squinting his eyes mostly shut, the draftsman raised his head to take in the full experience. A figure stood over the bed, hunched and laughing, holding some long and sharp and dripping tool in his hand. "So?" the draftsman asked. "What's the problem?" "Wow, this looks incredible," said a voice behind him. The head of the table was walking into the room, the entire executive board following after him and spreading out like a gaggle of geese to examine the walls, ignoring the velvet ropes and warning signs to run their hands over the still-drying red. "Very authentic. Well done." The draftsman nodded vaguely, not wanting to show any emotion for fear of not fitting with company culture, not wanting to take credit for the work that had been done here, and not wanting to appear in disagreement with the boss. So many things he struggled not to say and not to show, hidden under one small gesture. "By the way, I've been meaning to talk with you," said the head. "As we discussed yesterday, I went ahead and applied the premium murder experience surcharge to your account." The draftsman nodded vaguely. "And it seems," the head continued, "that you actually owe us a bit of money now. Now don't worry, because we have some work for you to do that could really help us out. We'd be doing each other a favor." The draftsman nodded vaguely. "The consultants today had a lot of eye-opening revelations for us, let me tell you. Ways to really lean into the authenticity of the intended experience. We synergized, really put our heads together, and knocked out a couple of concepts that I would love to see you put your personal spin on." "What do you mean?" asked the draftsman. "We want to go in a new direction with the marketing. We're going to need some more drafts." "More drafts?" "Yeah, something bold, fresh, scary enough for the family demographic, but classy as well to attract a more upper-middle-class market, but with a broad appeal as well for those with the willpower to scrimp and save a little." The executives had stopped admiring the room to circle around the draftsman, a kettle of vultures turning to boil him, their soulless eyes watching him greedily. The draftsman needed to think. He turned away to block out the sights of the premium murder experience, to maybe ask the head of maintenance his opinion, but found he had decided instead to take a nap on the bed, his body lying in a wet and crooked pose. "Remember now, it needs to be authentic this time. So, when can you start?" The draftsman felt the weight of the axe in his hand. "Immediately." Thank you for listening to The Premium Murder Experience. Please be sure to leave a like down below if you enjoyed the story, and feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you all out there. And if you'd like to hear more stories in the future, please subscribe. I upload at the same time every week. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.